This is the Loudest Crow. I'm Jonathan Louderback, and
I'm Justin Kroh, and we're here to call through the noise.
I honestly forget. Did I do it right that time?
You did it right that time. Good job.
Okay. I know I've made the joke, but I honestly was like 50-50 on whether... I'm always... When I walk up to, like... Whenever I'm driving my girlfriend, driving Randy's car, and she's the same exact way. So most American-made cars have the gas on the left side, whereas being German-made, it has on the right side. And... I'm not sure if that's actually a thing. That's what I hypothesize anyway. And every time I'm in the car and we're pulling up to get gas, we're both like, which side is the gas on again? You know?
Do you know how to find that out?
There's usually a little indicator on
the fuel gauge,
but there's not on this one.
There's not?
I don't know why there isn't. But there isn't.
That's so lame.
Yes,
Yes.
I know exactly what you're talking about. In fact, fun fact in Project Zomboid, there's a mod whose whole purpose is to add that to vehicles, to cars. Because on the actual 3D model, you can't see the little outline of the gas cap, so you just have to remember. Otherwise, but that adds it. It's really very, very helpful. Top tier mod.
That's hilarious, man. Because I remember it was just a couple years ago. I was on a vacation in Portland, and we were filling up a car that was like a rental car, and we were like, oh, we got sick of trying to remember where the gas tank was, and then my mom was like, wait, hold on, I remember this trick online. If you look at the fuel gauge, the little symbol, it's the arrow that points to it. And so from then on, I remember that for my car.
Yeah, it makes sense. It works.
Yeah.
But what I've noticed is really interesting about the way the mind functions is that if you rely on that, then suddenly, like, your brain automatically devotes less brain power. Because my truck has that, or maybe it's just habit, but, like, for some reason, not having that there means that I can't remember where it is.
See, I know mine's on the passenger side.
Well, I've driven Randy's car long enough now, obviously, that I've just told you it's on the right side. I remember that now, but it took a long-ass time to get there.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's just, and, the school year just started, so I think this is, like, a perfect segue in just talking about, like, schooling in general, and how I wonder what tools we use that actually make it harder to remember things long-term. Because, like, they talk about this study that they did where writing things down physically is way better for remembering than typing it in. And yet, in my computer science classes, like, we're typing everything. We barely write a thing down because we're already on computers to do the assignments. So, let me adjust this. We need some more John action.
Okay, I gotta get my thigh out of frame.
But we, we use all these online tools and type everything in, and so I fear that, as a computer science major, I'm not going to retain nearly as much of what I need. But at the same time, as our world becomes more digital, we just do things online more. And so maybe as time goes on and as generations come up, we'll rewire ourselves to remember things that are online better.
I could definitely see that being the case, but I do think that the advantages to memory of writing something down are implicit rather than learned. It's not like an evolutionary thing we picked up, but more because you're
taking more time, right?
You're taking more time, you're using more muscles. It's like whenever you're playing the piano, the number one thing that you're taught, like they always try to teach you form. There's a proper form to piano. And it's to kind of keep it's like you don't really want to just be playing with your wrist. You don't want to be twisting your wrist. Like, you can use your wrist, but you really want it to, like, start the whole motion of playing the piano from your, like, almost through your entire arm. And one of the biggest reasons of that is because you have such more fine control if you include the entire motion of your arm, right, than if you're just hyper-focusing on using your wrist. And it's kind of a similar principle where, with writing, you're activating so many more functions as a human being than typing, right? And that being said, too, typing is rather than you interpreting, pushing through your body to your hand and having to do the symbol, it is you see symbol, you press button. It's like cutting out the middleman. Although I will say this about your worry, that I had that at that point came up in a flash, but my original point I was going to make is you as a computer scientist are always going to have access to Google, search engines, and you should never restrict yourself from trying to use those things.
Yeah.
Because why would you, right? And if you get to a point as a computer scientist where you're no longer able to access those things, then maybe the world's really fucked up, right? And we have different concerns at that point in time.
Well, and I do suppose part of it is like theory versus practice. As computer science majors, like we do extensive work to memorize this theory, not necessarily by writing it down, because computer programming, as concrete as it is logically, it's too abstract. The problem-solving aspect is too abstract to just say, here is how you do it, right? So a lot of our assignments and such are about, problem-solving and having different ways of approaching it and learning how to check how good and optimized our algorithms and functions and stuff are. And so it's less, here are certain facts you need to memorize, or here are certain like linear concepts to grasp. It's more about the process of it all, because it's a practice. Well, there's a huge practice element in computer science, whereas theory it is more about like, hey, computer scientists have devised these things, but you don't need to memorize all these sorting algorithms, for example. You should feel free to look them up as long as you understand how they work.
I think as a computer scientist, the vast amount of work you're going to be doing is not going to exist in that upper theoretical space, too.
Yeah.
You learn. It's like there's a difference between the work that a PhD in a computer science could do working in a research laboratory than you would working on a video game.
That's fair, yeah, because if you're a Mr. PhD computer scientist, man, you might be like working on quantum computers, or you might be working on like, oh, what if we develop like a HTML6, or like really not just, or you might be developing like the next type of hardware, like right now what's weird is that CPUs are good at some things and GPUs are good at other things, and I'm wondering if at some point
they're gonna fuse.
Yeah, someone's gonna fuse them and be like fusion. So I wonder if that's going to happen, or any other myriad of things that might happen in the world of computers, because things have just been happening so fast in the last couple decades. But and especially with AI, like those people who are at the top in the theory level are like trying to push it to its limits and see exactly what it can do, and they may push us into the technological singularity where we have an AI that has programmed itself to be better at reprogramming itself to be better so much that it's just like infinite power. Well, actually, no, it couldn't do that because it would probably need a bigger power supply to do bigger operations and more complex operations.
It is limited, and it's really weird to think about this because sometimes cyberspace can feel unlimited, but there is a very physical dimension to computing that was more apparent in the early days of computing, but is still there nowadays. It's like, a terabyte of data is a lot to an ordinary consumer, but it's still finite, right? The electricity produced by the American power grid, it seems infinite, but it is still finite, right?
Well,
so,
and as time goes on, like, we scale up like the quality of all of our resources that computers are dealing with, and so as things get crazy huge when it comes to how much computers can do, we also demand more of computers because we're like, hey, you can afford to have 4K textures in this game now at 120 FPS, 240 FPS. So do that, please. And so that stuff would be unimaginable 30 years ago, but now it's a bit more complicated.
Something that's really interesting to me is, so I remember, this is just like a fragment of a post that I read, but optimization is so incredibly important, and I think in the modern gaming industry it's something that's left to the wayside. I saw this meme is what it was. It was like in the early days of development. Oh yeah, so you could run this game on your toaster, you could run this game on your spatula, you could run this game on all this. Here's all these extra features. Here's this free DLC. Nowadays it's like they have modern technology, but you have indie games or AAA games that aren't even the best looking or aren't even the most innovative, but run like shit.
Yeah.
Right? Because they just kind of lean too hard on the crutch.
Exactly. Well,
of the resources that they have.
And especially with like PC games, as time goes on, people will have a wider and wider variety of parts because more parts will be made available and whatnot. And so it gets crazy when you're a PC developer, because it's just like, I'm optimizing for, you'll probably optimize a little bit for your machine, but what does that look like for other machines? Because again, with CPUs and GPUs, some games run poorly because your GPU isn't good enough. Some games run poorly because your CPU isn't good enough. And then the other games will just run poorly for other reasons that are totally baloney.
It's like Hearts of Iron 4. It's a, almost 10-year-old game now. It's gonna be 8 years old this coming year. And it is not the prettiest game, but it is incredibly CPU intensive because you're handing artificial intelligence, all these scripts, control of thousands of little units.
Yeah.
And the reason the game gets so laggy is that over time, they generate more and more units as to replicate the ramping up of Total War and World War II, right? It makes sense. It's logical.
Yeah.
Hundreds of units for each nation and tens of nations make thousands of units. And, by 1945 in the game will be running to an absolute fucking standstill, even though it's on the same system, and it's just purely because it's an unsolvable kind of issue.
It is.
Right?
Right. Other than more memory, please. Right?
Or reduce the number of units.
Yeah.
Or I'm sure there's some sort of technological witchcraft you could do to optimize it on the inside, but there is the work to do that now would be monumental, as the game's already been released, as it already has all these extra DLC, all these extra moving pieces.
Yeah. And honestly, I think it's for that reason that I think game sequels are a good thing, and developers shouldn't be afraid of doing sequels to not just push the game further and innovate, but to give themselves room to innovate. Because if you work with the same thing for too long, and you'll just have these mountains of old code that are bad or unoptimized or written for different hardware or written with a different software or something. I'm never going to do a sequel for Enter the Backrooms, for example.
If you did, you would change so much.
Yeah, I would change so much, and it'd be better. I still have a lot more to learn over at university when it comes to optimization. One thing I learned yesterday from a video about a weird shader is that the CPU is good at giving instructions to the GPU, and the GPU will just do its thing, right? And it'll produce the images that you want to produce. However, reading the output of the GPU back into the CPU is apparently super expensive and really bad. Why you would ever want to do that, I don't know, because theoretically, if you're producing images,
you said those directly to the screen.
Yeah, you're sending those to the screen, so why would you need to pull them back if you sent them to the screen? But there might be some algorithms where it's say you have this code that tells you to draw these fancy little images, and you can't predict with a dynamic piece of art. I don't remember what we call it, but with generative art, where you give it some math and it makes cool shapes and colors based off that math. Over time, you can't really predict what it will look like, because a lot of it's just procedurally generated. And so then you might be like, hey, give me whatever is on the screen at this moment in time or something. But doing that 60 frames per second, you just can't do that, because the CPU is really bad at reading data back from the GPU. And so for some games, I wonder if they're doing stuff like that that are unoptimized, or I wonder if even game engines do that to an extent. I don't know why they would. But
immediately, and I'm not sure, this is just kind of a half-formed notion, but the notion of the images being generated by the GPU being translated into real things immediately comes to mind. From my understanding, there is usually the skeleton of the game of interacting actors that is the actual game, right? You could play, for example, Enter the Backrooms with nothing but polygonal shapes. Right. It's just that you produce images for the sake of the player that is then superimposed onto those shapes, right? Or maybe better rephrasing it, hitboxes hitting hitboxes.
Yes.
Is usually what you... is what the actual game is. But maybe there's this... Because I know, for example, Mortal Kombat... it's not like the small fighting is, like Mortal Kombat, the hitboxes are literally tied to the model. It's not like that in most fighting games, but in Mortal Kombat, if you barely skim past somebody's toe when you're trying to hit them, you miss because the actual player model in real time is the actual hitbox, which is not usually how they operate. So
I'm wondering if super expensive.
Yeah, so I wonder if there's something to do with making the generated thing a real object for the CPU to interact with that is going on. But that's just uninformed. Well, I have no fucking clue what I'm talking about.
You think about what a model is. It's a collection of polygons. And so you can write algorithms to be like, hey, is this point of this character intersecting this mesh, right? And mesh-based collision detection is expensive. But if you're doing a fighting game, then you can
really kind of ultra polish
a
very simple You only have the two models to think about.
Exactly, like you don't have like this procedurally generated world or something like in an MMO.
You have a pre-generated backdrop, and you just have the characters that you're processing.
Exactly, yeah. So, with fighting games, you can get away with stuff like that. But like, say you just have like I don't know, Skyrim, not Skyrim, Elder Scrolls 6, trying to have collisions like that in that game. I think it's just ludicrous. And that's one thing that I think a lot of indie game developers and even AAA studios do wrong, is they try to be super precise and perfect when they really don't need to be. Like, they try to have too much detail for the kind of game that they're wanting to make.
I think a lot of it is, and I think game critics make fun of it, this trend in the industry towards better graphics, more detailed, look at this. But that stuff sells games to the vast majority of the population, because the vast majority of the population aren't game critics. They're people who buy a game, sit down and play it a little bit, and then never think of it again.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, who are the people who buy Call of Duty every single time without fail? They're usually, by and large, there's definitely a hardcore Call of Duty crowd.
Yeah.
Like, that loves the game, that just loves what it is. But there's also the very big casual crowd of people who's like, oh, the new Call of Duty's game out, I want to play it. They buy it, and they're called in by the new, better graphics and whatever it is, and then that's a really well-grossing game for Activision Blizzard, and then they move on with their day.
Yeah.
The truth of the matter is, masterpiece, like, work of art games don't usually become big sellers. By and large.
Usually, yeah.
There are, I think, exceptions to the norm, where you happen to find that confluence between, like, artistic integrity and mass marketability, like Baldur's Gate, for example, that just came out. I think that game has sold like fucking crazy.
Yeah, because everyone keeps talking about how good it is, right? Mm-hmm. But it is hard because just with any like work of art, doing it masterfully and following conventions and following trends are usually. They're usually mutually exclusive. Sometimes you can find a nice middle ground, like you said. But like, and sometimes like things will just take off, and no one can explain why. They just enter the pop culture scene for one.
Kind of like Undertale. I mean, Undertale is very good, but I don't necessarily. I think that sometimes it's timing. Like there's just like this want culturally for this thing, and then something that happens to fill that niche.
Yeah.
Kind of like Phasmophobia, or just I think a great example of this is Among Us.
Among Us, yeah.
Right, Among Us, like a social deduction game that you play online with your friends that came out, or what didn't come out, but reached popularity during COVID.
Yeah. Like,
every game has its time, it feels. And I definitely feel like, because like I remember there was an article that received a lot of pushback a little while ago. It's like, hey, single-player games are dying. And a lot of people are like, no.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a big demand for well-put-together, reasonably priced, reasonably monetized games like Baldur's Gate. And it just so happens that there's a big push towards that right now.
Yeah. It is awesome to see games that are, right now, like, games that are more focused on the single player getting some attention and limelight. Because you were talking about Call of Duty. Like, I couldn't care less.
I really don't.
I mean, because, like, it's like, yeah, you get to shoot stuff. There are plenty of games that have done that. I'm so much more interested in innovative games. Like Baldur's Gate 3, I'm interested in. I don't know if I'll get it. But just an RPG game that, has a carefully crafted narrative and is extremely, what's it called? It builds on itself. That dynamic, emergent. An emergent game where it's like, these mechanics that just kind of lead to lots of complex interactions.
It very much is that. It's interesting to... I think what I would describe Baldur's Gate as is the RPG cranked to 10. Right? It is just like they put so much work, so much... Because it's one of those things where you sit down and you're like, oh, if you want to have a voice character, then that's going to be a lot of work, right? And they're like, yes, but we did it anyway.
Oh, we did it
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like just the amount of work hours and people and hands on the project to allow all of these emergent factors to play out is absolutely crazy. Especially for the length of the game that it is. It's like a 60-hour video game.
Yeah, I watched an IGN interview, and they were saying it took them like 90 hours or 100 hours to get through like the main story.
I can easily see that. I don't even think I'm like a quarter of the way through, and I've been playing it for like 15. right? Part of that is because it is poorly optimized. Well, of course, I don't have the best system, but it's rather poorly optimized. It crashes, but that's because it just is an absolute juggernaut.
Yeah. Well, and that is an interesting thing that developers need to consider. It's because you do have to eventually, if you're trying to innovate or make a game with a lot of detail, you have to be like, okay, what is the minimum threshold for running this game? Because, we want to make our audience as big as possible, but we also want to... Sometimes to make your audience as big as possible, you have to cut out some of the people on the lower end to attract the people who are attracted to things like good graphics and stuff like that. So you have to make those trade-offs, and it is pretty difficult. One game that I love is Marble It Up. I don't know if I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I'm going to talk about it now. So it's a 3D platformer where you're playing as a marble. You're rolling around, hopping between platforms. And to me, it is a game that it's not very innovative. Like, not going to lie, because there have been like marble games before that had like arguably more features because they had like more power-ups and more elements in each level. But I love Marble It Up Ultra more than any of those because it's a lot more consistent with its visuals and with its like style and everything. I love the music, but the gameplay is just perfect. It is honed in like as much as I could imagine it being honed in because the level design is super good. The way your marble bounces around and interacts with the world is super crisp and tight and neat. You feel completely in control while you're playing, and although they have less things that they slap on top of stages, like fewer power-ups or fewer types of platforms or hazards or whatever, they bake into the design of the level tons of mechanics. There's one level where because most of the time you're just going straight from the start to the goal.
It's like Monkey Ball, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love that game.
And then there's some levels where like you have to collect all the gems before you can end the level. And so it's about routing your way through the level and finding the fastest path between all of them to get to the end. There's one level I love called Siege, where you start right below a huge ramp. And there's some power-ups on that ramp that let you launch off of it really high into the air. And then you fall into this network of castles and corridors. And you depending on where you land, you'll take a certain path down to the beginning of the castle, and each path has like a gem at the end of it. And so you're just launching yourself into the air, and it's this whole there and back again cycle of picking different paths to travel along through this castle to get the gems. And I was like, how do they think of this? Is launching yourself into a castle in this marble game? That's so crazy. And then like there's another level where like it also has a castle set called Citadel, and you're going through the Citadel, and it's like just a whole adventure, like a mini game where you're traveling through the battlements of this castle, and you're avoiding these things called bashers that try to knock you off the stage and using power-ups and stuff. It's really fun. There's another level called Ricochet where you have to angle yourself to bounce off of platforms that like ricochet you off at like certain angles and stuff. And so you get to go super fast while bouncing all over the place. It's so fun. And there are plenty other levels I could talk about. But what I love about the game so much is that it's not trying to be overly ambitious. It's not trying to, have some kind of story that tugs at your heartstrings. It is trying to be fun in its purest form. And I think that's why Nintendo is so popular, because their games exemplify fun. Tears of the Kingdom, its visual style isn't anywhere close to the top visual fidelity games nowadays. But that's just it. It's a visual style, because they realize that the important aspects of their game don't necessarily lie in the visuals. Although I would argue it's still
it's still a gorgeous
game. But it lies in the mechanics and how the emergent mechanic of building things works.
Yeah, they looked at Breath of the Wild and said, okay, so we're not gonna worry about the graphics at all, at all. No, we're just not gonna worry about that. We already have a gym. How do we, once again, sharpen that to a razor edge? How do we just make people want to play this game even more than they already have? And they're like, okay, so big, like Elden Ring. I know you're not a Dark Souls person, but it's like Elden Ring, which is like, okay, we know you like this stuff. Here's more of it.
Here's more of it, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think too many people get wrapped up in the idea of making the next big game. Especially nowadays, when making games is easier, you don't have to have as big of a team to make a good quality game, because you have engines and tools and computers are getting more powerful, and the tools that we use to make things like graphic designs and any kind of visual art and audio and stuff like that.
I'm gonna grab myself another cup of coffee. Keep talking.
You go for it. Yeah. So all that's getting honed and making it easier and more accessible to make a game. And so we have so many people who are trying to stand out and stand above the crowd by making the next hit game, making something that gets super trendy, or it's something that has an innovative feature, something that has a big hook to it. And I think people mistake a hook for something wholly original. Because I think there are plenty of games out there that, while they don't have any wholly original elements, it's their assembly of familiar elements that makes them special, makes them memorable, makes them stand out. Because this Marvel It Up game, which I don't think a lot of people have heard about, to me, it is one of the best 3D platformers I've ever played, if not the best, right? And it's not because it tried to be anything more than a really good 3D platformer. It's just a really good 3D platformer. It didn't need an advanced story about the Marble Kingdom versus the Basher Kingdom or anything like that. It didn't need to make me question my place in existence and the nature of reality.
Yeah, at the same time, it's like there are places for those types of games though, and I think immediately like Stanley Parable.
Yeah. Right, but then with the Stanley Parable, it's not trying to be the next thing in terms of graphics. It's trying to push narratives and games further than they've ever been pushed.
I love this idea of finding your thing. I think what game developers, especially indie game developers, and the ones that are successful do is you find what you enjoy. Just find what you have fun with, and really just push that. Like if you want to make a movement shooter, then just find, if that's your thing, push that to its razor edge. If you're a narrative writer, push that to its razor edge, and just have fun with the concepts that you enjoy working with. And you see that a lot in the most successful games, I think.
Yeah.
I was thinking you started referencing that sort of that idea, that motif, and it's I realized D&D is a game fundamentally, but what's really interesting is that the advent of live plays and just its popularization in media, and kind of makes it sometimes feel like something that needs to be perfected or honed. And it can be, it definitely can be, but it's also something you're meant to sit down and enjoy. It's not something to be dreaded. And if you're creating a video game in the same vein, you shouldn't be. Sometimes you probably dread it, but it shouldn't be it should be 70-30.
Yeah.
It should be more fun than it is misery.
Right, I can compare it to, say, rock climbing, for example. Or mountain climbing, I'll put it that way. You don't want to walk up to, just a sheer cliff face that you'll likely fall off.
And then call yourself stupid if you didn't do it.
Yeah. Well, you want to go for something that's challenging but approachable. And while you're going up, it needs to be an enjoyable experience, not an arduous one that you dread, like you said. Obviously there should be some sort of fear factor to it, because I think if you're not afraid of it at all, then are you really taking any risks? Are you really doing anything meaningful?
It is if everything is a balancing act.
Yeah.
There are so many games that play it safe that you never talk about ever again, like Call of Duty.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure there's plenty of people who enjoy making shooters that play Call of Duty, that help develop Call of Duty. At the same time, though, it's like any art. So it's just so thoroughly subjective. I think the biggest thing that you could do as a designer of any variety, though, is it kind of plays into that make it fun aspect. But it's remove yourself from being a slave to the expectations of the people who are going to play your game.
Yeah.
Right. I think a lot of developers and a lot of designers, a lot of anyone who works with people or works in the creative space are okay, what can I do to make this loved? But not, what can I do to make myself love this? Right?
And I think that, the second question is much better.
I saw a video recently of this guy who's he's this really beefy, biker looking dude, really, really ripped. He's check out this art I did. I'm really proud of it. And it was it looked like a still from a SpongeBob episode, but he's dude, this is Sharpie. Check this out. He turns around. This is showing it off. He's super proud of it the entire time. I just thought it was very, very empowering that there's somebody out there, an artist that actually likes what they do. I have to call them back.
It's podcast time. It's Loudest Crow time. So it's very interesting to see. Like you said, this kind of applies to any creative field, and as things get pushed, and as people try to find avenues for innovation and stuff, it can get distracting. Is the word I would use, where it's like, oh, I gotta mold my work to the desires of the people. But I'll say this: people are really bad at knowing what they want. They're horrible at that. So it's like, if most gamers or most of anyone, and for any reason, since people are just bad at knowing what they want, don't even try to predict what they want, right? Like in my interaction design class, like we're talking about the ethics of design, because interaction design is usually with like user interfaces, but really it's just anything that you have to use. Like you could argue that an interaction design person would have to think about the car. Like how is the person who drives the car going to use it? How are they going to know where things are in the car intuitively? Are they going to have a way to know where the fuel gauge is, or not fuel gauge, the fuel tank is? Without getting out to check, stuff like that. But in our interactive design class, we have to talk about, a lot of the time people don't know what they want, people don't know what they're looking for, and so while you don't need to necessarily tell them what they should want, you just have to, make your product in such a way that they end up wanting it, and that you need to make your product in a way that it fills a need that they have that they might not even be conscious of. Like, think of I don't know. Think of like an everyday tool or item that you use.
I entirely get the energy you're going for. It's like, I'm sure people. It's like, I think a good example recently that you might have seen on the Steam charts, even if you're not, because I haven't played it or been around in the space a lot, but talking about shooters, Battle Block Theater, or
I know what you're talking. Yeah, Battle Block Theater.
The Theater or whatever it's called. Not Battle Block Theater, but because that's a different game. But there's that game on that was number one for a while, like Battle Brick or something, that looked like Roblox. It was a FPS shooter.
I think I may have seen that once.
Well, it was basically there's this shooter that gets to the top of the Steam charts, and it looks like Roblox. It's not bad looking, like fidelity, like style wise, but it's definitely like low fidelity. It looks like a Roblox shooter that was given a lot of polish. Yet it's number one on the Steam charts for like a month. Right? Because people didn't realize that they didn't care about the graphics. They cared about the gameplay more than anything else.
Yeah.
This unannounced, basically out of nowhere game probably sold millions of dollars worth of copies on Steam because people wanted this thing and they didn't know. And I'm sure there were people that did that. Like, I wish I had that exact game.
Yeah.
And there have been plenty of people who have been saying these because I think people are really good at voicing specific complaints about things that they want to love. And I think that the people who are successful are the ones who gather those complaints in aggregate and solve them all at once.
Yeah.
In a package. In a convenient package.
Yeah, well, and like with my experience with Enter the Backrooms, as I was updating it, though the way I knew I was making good progress is reviews were getting more, like negative reviews specifically, were getting more distinct. Or
it wasn't like game bad, it was like...
Well, no. Reviews were contradicting one another more. So one person would give a negative review saying, there's not enough stuff going on in this game. It's too empty. It's just too much wandering around with not much going on. And then another reviewer would say, this game is too busy. It doesn't let me just immerse myself in the atmosphere. It has too much stuff going on. And I'm like, even though there's two negative reviews right there, that's how I know I hit the sweet spot. Because the majority of players would liked the game and left positive reviews because they felt I went between those two extremes in a good way. And so, while I think reviews can certainly be used to like with complaints, they can certainly be used to improve a game. But I also think complaints can be used to assess like the success of a game's goals.
Oh, for sure.
Because like if the people's complaints in reviews or whatever are like opposite sides of one another, or if they are complaining about an element of the game that was very intentional. Take Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. If people are leaving negative reviews saying, this game ruined my life and I hate everything, good. That was the point of the game. You successfully accomplished your goals. And I think that's another thing that game developers need to get better at, is defining what their goal is with a game. Because I want to make a shooter. That's a pretty weak goal. Like it's a goal, and if you want that to be your goal, that's fine. But I think your goal should be a bit deeper than that. Like, I want to make a shooter that resembles this, or I want to make a shooter with really...
what is it? There's a term for what you're saying. It's like... Make your goal short, actionable, achievable, short-term, actionable, achievable, and there's some other thing. But like, there's a number of premises. Don't make your goal a pie in the sky.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Make your goal. Because if you say shooter, what does that mean? But if you say I want to do a shooter inspired by this, that is on this system, that has this, that it kind of accomplishes this vibe, it really helps you in the creative process. Really helps you doing that. Like recently in the D&D campaign I'm about to run, I'm like, I really want to iron out and talk about players and be like, okay, what type of game do you want to play? What type of scenarios would inspire you in terms of role play and in terms of combat? Like, what feed me, even if just one word sentences, even if just vague ideas. Having that source of fuel, having those things that I know to work towards, will be able to be like as prompts for my creative work. Because sometimes whenever you sit down at the beginning of any creative project, you're like, starting is the hardest part because you don't know where you want to end. You know, you're like, I know I want to do a thing, but the exact image of that thing is difficult. I will say too, similar but on kind of a different tangent, sometimes the most important thing you do, even if you don't have a specific goal in mind, is just to do it.
Just do something.
Just to do something. Because something breeds something, breeds something, breeds something. You could always jump off something if you have something.
That's like the whole like mantra of this podcast.
Yeah, very, very much so.
We love breeding here at the Loudest Crow.
Oh, I thought you said reading, but you said breeding.
Yeah, because
I was failing to see the nature of the joke, but I
mean, we love both. Yeah.
Maybe one while doing the other.
Yeah.
This is a very dangerous joke. This is a very dangerous joke that we're telling here.
It is, but it's also like maximally efficient.
Maximally efficient. Oh my god.
It reminds me, the other day, my dad was like watching a sportscaster or something, and he was complaining because it kept adding suffixes to the ends of words to make themselves sound smarter. And he was like, "Why do people do that? It's so stupid."
Well, it's like I'm reading my textbook, and essentially my world politics textbook was saying, okay, so we want to give you the entire first chapter was interpreting world politics. We want to give you the analytical tools to become a lifelong understand, like to be able to understand actions that occur in your life better for the rest of your life. And I feel like I just summed up that chapter in a sentence, and you could have had that chapter in a sentence with the terms I wanted you to know, and then you'd be done. But instead it felt like we had 3, 4 pages of fucking filler, and my eyes would glaze over as I read it. You know, I feel like a lot of people in the humanities feel like they have to justify their career path.
Yeah. Well, to build off that, my ethics book that I've been reading, I read a chapter for it last night. It was a fine chapter. It was talking about logic, how to build a good logical argument, and logical fallacies that are very common. Things like, what's it called? Denying the antecedent. Because if I say, if X is true, then Y is true, right? So if I say X is false, that means Y is false, right?
No.
No, yeah, exactly. Because, Y's true or falsity is only dependent on X if X is true. Because that means Y has to be true. Conversely, there's affirming the consequence, or the constant, or whatever it's called. The consequent, that's what it's called. And that's when I say, if P is true, then Q is true, right? And so if I say, oh yeah, Q is true, that means P is true, right? Well, no, not necessarily.
Because you haven't established a cumulative set of events yet.
Exactly. Q is still logically related to P, or Y is logically related to Y. I mean, Y is logically related to X, but it's not like a two-way street, unless you say if and only if, and that becomes a whole other thing. But still, I thought it was interesting, but the problem with it in the textbook was that description I just gave you, that was like spread out across like 5 pages. And I'm just like, we learned this in discrete math, and it was so much faster, and it was so much easier to understand the way we put it there. And it was just like, you really have to go into this much detail to tell me some like very basic logical stuff.
I will say sometimes, because sometimes it depends on the learner, and sometimes having context and fluff assists in grasping a deeper concept. Because sometimes if you throw a concept, like a raw concept at a person, they're like, oh, like I can't handle all this, right? Just too much at once.
Yeah.
Well, and then sometimes you can be drip feed it to somebody, but in the context of a textbook, it's like, I guess it depends a lot on the subject. It's like, It depends, and it does depend a lot on the writing. It's so subjective, but I would agree with you in general. It's like, yeah,
it's just so much. Well, and I feel like sometimes what they're doing is they drop the concept on you, and they state it over and over and over with lots of different wordings to get not only give people time to like digest it, but also to give them the highest chance of understanding it. So it's like you can understand it this way, or this way, or this way, or this way. And even though I just said the same thing 4 times, I put it in different contexts. Almost like looking at the same object but shining a flashlight on it certain ways. For some people, like if hold up an apple, shine a flashlight right at it from this side, I'm not going to be able to tell it's an apple. I'm going to be like, there's just a black thing in front of me. But if I shine the flashlight from this side, I'll be like, that's an apple. I feel like that's what a lot of books are doing.
At the same time, though, in the context of... Because that is like a good faith take of what books are doing whenever they're drawing out and examining it from multiple angles. But the truth of it, too, is if you look at it in a very like top-down view or just like a very personal view, like looking at the textbook over there, it's like, that textbook cost me $50.
Yeah.
And that's cheap. I got it used on Amazon. Like, that's not... Like, textbooks cost more than that.
Yeah, generally. Right? Yeah.
So you're like, okay, so this motherfucker cost me $50. Get to the goddamn point. You know what I mean? And education is so fascinating. Being a college student, working a job, and having like another life too is so fascinating because it definitely feels like you have to like speed run deriving the value if you want to derive value from the courses you are taking. And definitely, I totally am in favor of academia. I think it's important. I think it needs to exist. But I do think there's a big bend in academia towards justifying its own existence.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right. Especially with the humanities, like you mentioned, because with something like computer science, at least I can always say this is going to be useful in a job at some point.
Well, you can give a practical application.
Yeah.
Whereas the humanities do have practical applications, they're just harder to prove.
They're hard, exactly. Like this isn't exactly the point that you were making, but in ethics today, we had a very interesting conversation where it's about, so what's true? What makes something true? And you said, well, if it's a fact. And I was like, okay, yeah, great. So what are some facts? It's like, Jupiter is bigger than Earth. Great. That's an observable truth. Out there in the universe, out there in reality, it's like, as far as we all know, that's the case, As Descartes said, we could all be wrong. There could be no Jupiter out there for all I know, but I'm pretty sure there's Jupiter out there, and we don't need to debate that any further. And like 1 + 1 being 2, that's even more, that's even more provable and true, technically, because that's a logical truth. So it doesn't require the existence of other objects. It's just something that's true. Or like the fact that all bachelors are unmarried men. That has to be true. Because logically, based on the definitions of those terms that I just used and the order I assembled them in, that is a true statement.
Then we talk about semantics.
Yeah, and then we talk about semantics, and then we talk about ethics, and we're like, okay, so is it true that killing someone is bad? Well, what's the context? Okay, is it true that killing someone for no reason is bad? Not necessarily. There's nothing inherent in that statement that makes it a fact that killing someone with no reason is bad. Now, pretty much everyone will agree and believe that killing someone with no reason is bad, but then you have to beg the question of, well, why? Why do we all believe that? Why do we all agree with that? Is this a moral code that exists like embedded in reality? Is it a social construct? Is it somewhere in between? Is it divinely inspired? And so right out the gate, it's just very interesting because it's like you said, it's subjective as much as we want morality to not be subjective.
Morality is going to be subjective as long as we do not have a direct pipeline to either a divine entity or to, some sort of underwritten bylaw of living. It's like, morality is so fascinating because you can become entirely convinced that your morality is proper, but then still be entirely wrong. Right? Yeah. It's like, in this context of examining like the subjective nature of like, why does everyone agree death is bad? You sometimes have people who don't think that way, and then everyone has to gang up on them and be like, no, killing people is bad. Why are you doing that? Right? In the context of, say, a serial killer or a sociopath or a psychopath might be like, I morally object to the idea that killing is bad. I think it's okay. I think it's fine. That's why I do it. And they oftentimes, it's like whenever you have a compelling villain in fiction, it's like you listen to somebody speak and you're like, well, logically they're sound, but their logic exists over here and my morals exist over here. Like, it's like they're almost two differently, similarly shaped, but differently existing logical chains.
Well, and that's why moral arguments are hard, because this book introduced some terminology. You can say an argument is logically valid if it's like true versus false statements that it presents line up
Well,
perfectly.
yeah, it's the premises and the conclusion.
Yeah.
If the premises support the conclusion, then it's logical.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean any of the premises have to be true. They could all be false premises, but as long as you have a logical train of thought throughout your premises that lead to the conclusion, then it's a
Well,
valid.
actually, it's still not a valid argument. The premises are if the premises, if two false premises lead to a false conclusion, it's logical but still false.
Well, no, like it's valid but still false. It's valid but still false in this book's terminology. So where you want to get is a sound argument where all your premises are true, but with morality, we just kind of discussed how things can't be true necessarily inherently, and if they can be, we don't know what they are exactly. And there's debate about that too. But like, well, my belief, for example, as a Christian, what I believe is I'm an absolutist. I do believe there are things that are objectively right and objectively wrong. What I don't believe is that I'm right about what's objectively right and objectively wrong. And so as a Christian, I try my best to be like, okay, what would God say about this? And I take my best guess. But taking my best guess is also admitting that I could very well be wrong. Like, for example, with LGBT people, I do believe that following a lifestyle that aligns with the LGBT community is wrong because of what God says in the Bible. And we don't need to get into why. But I'm fully willing to admit that maybe God is totally fine with that, and I'm just reading things in the Bible that He didn't intend for me to do. Which is why when we had a conversation earlier about like why my Assemblies of God denomination, I'm like, well, first of all, because I was raised into that, but because of all the denominations I've encountered, it's the one that I think holds the most truth. But I'm willing to admit that I could be reading things out of Scripture incorrectly, and I could be wrong. So while I do believe there are preferences of God, and He wants things to be a certain way, and He wants things to not be certain ways, I'm not going to tell anyone, oh yeah, I know exactly how God wants it, because I think that's just baloney. And anyone who says that, I think is deceiving themselves. At least with everything. Like, I think with stuff like the Ten Commandments, the Christians can agree that God wants this. But when you have to start considering a lot of other questions, things like abortion, because like abortion doesn't appear in the Bible, so asking the question, does God approve of abortion? It's like, I don't know. I don't think He would, but I don't know. And also, some abortions I think are morally right, and some I do think are morally wrong. And so I'm like, I don't know. And that can apply to pretty much any ethical dilemma that we face.
I think ethics are so fascinating because inside our objective reality exists a myriad of various subjective ethical doctrines.
Yeah.
So it is impossible, as I think somebody who, say, is educated, is world literate, to say my ethical doctrine is guaranteed, number one, perfect, because the mere existence of another ethical doctrine disproves that disproves that yours could be 100% certain. That you could be 100% certain in yours, but at the same time, the existence of other ethical doctrines does not necessarily mean that yours is wrong.
Yeah.
It's like the ethical doctrine of Nazi Germany does not say, just because the ethical doctrine of Nazi Germany does not mean or does not imply that the Christian dogma is inherently wrong. So at that point, whenever dogmas are not certain, but they are not also guaranteed to be false, then I think we exist in a space as human beings where we are allowed to articulate what we find to be the correct or most actionable ethical dogma, even if we cannot never be certain, because the correct action in face of uncertainty is not inaction, obviously, because otherwise nothing would happen.
You gotta give it your best shot.
You gotta give it your best shot and operate off of those principles. So finding your ethical dogma and not necessarily dying on the hill, refusing the change, but living your life in accordance to it, I do not think is negative. But I do think that there is a possibility, maybe not of deriving a perfect doctrine in aggregate from everybody, because there's so much contradictory stuff. Like you couldn't just combine everyone's dogma together and say we're good to go because there's so much shit that's contradictory. However, I do think that it is possible through finding the most common and the most logically sound dogmas and tenets of these doctrines that we can perhaps find not the best but the most actionable and serviceable one.
Yeah.
That is the most removed from individual bias. So, for example, with being anti-LGBT, I just fundamentally disagree with being anti the lifestyle of somebody that is LGBT. Because to me, from a historical perspective, it is impossible to remove being anti-different from patriarchal societies forming hierarchical power structures that then enforce the cultural. It was to enforce power rather than to enforce what was correct, and power does not obviously necessitate ethical
very much
goodness. So it's very difficult. I think I've said what I've said rather well, but it's still such a difficult area because I speak out of the position of not having an ethical dogma of my own. I have tenets that I uphold to be true. Like, I am fully in support of people who are LGBT. I am honestly pro-choice. But if you were to ask me, oh, well, are you killing somebody whenever you have an abortion? I would be like, I don't know. And I think there gets to be a point where it's like, you don't have to have a justification for everything that you believe, but you have to be willing to hear out somebody else who's trying to persuade you that you're wrong. And you have to be willing to sit and steep with the other side's argument, and if you still feel like that can't be true, then you've grappled with it. Then you can live more comfortably in your ethical doctrine, or more comfortably with your tenets than otherwise. For me, on the abortion matter, it's like, I'm pro-choice not necessarily out of a position of actual morality, but out of a position of practicality. Abortion is usually utilized by people who are not ready to be parents. And I think many people who are anti-abortion are usually people who didn't have difficult lives growing up, or at least traditionally difficult lives in the context of socioeconomics. And so it could be impossible to grasp what that kind of situation would be like, yet I can easily understand why aborting something that I do not see necessarily as a life to prevent it growing into a life that would be miserable would be more ethical. It's interesting. I think a lot of my morality, even though I don't necessarily immediately agree with the tenets, I forget what the philosophical idea is called, but like where you measure pain against pleasure, and whichever wins is the proper moral decision. I forget what it's called.
I forget too, but I think I know what you're talking about.
Well, it's like it solves the problem of saying, well, obviously you have to change it to run over the one because that's fewer lives than the four.
Oh, the trolley problem?
Yeah, well, that's just like that would be that. I forget what it's named, but like there's a dogma if you're not familiar that is every decision can be boiled down into pain versus pleasure, and the decision you should take is the one that leads to more pleasure over pain. Right? You could boil it down to those things. Pain being death, disease, poverty.
Really quick, so a couple things. But I loved a lot of the things you said. I remember like the last year in my intro to philosophy class, and I imagine we'll talk about it a lot in my ethics class. Aristotle says that politics is the most noble science because it's a social science, and politics is our attempt to aggregate our morality, and to bring it together and be like, okay, what kind of moral code is going to work for the most people and produce the most happiness? Because happiness aims at the good, and we only do things because we think in some way that they're good. Cost-benefit analysis. Everything that you do it because you think overall it's a good decision. Whether it is morally correct or not morally correct is a different question. Because for a serial killer, they might think, oh, well, I'm going to kill someone, and I'll make sure it's someone who doesn't really matter that much, because if I do it, then I'll feel this immense relief of pressure, because for whatever reason, I feel pressure to kill someone right now. And so they'll go do that, and then they may feel a little bit of relief, even if it's all in their head. And then they'll be like, well, if I just keep doing this, then it's worth it for me to feel relieved, especially the people who I kill, won't be missed. And so that's why you see so many hookers and prostitutes getting killed. Because it's really easy to kill them and get away with it. I've been watching a lot of police interrogations, and serial killers often just go after people, hanging out in the street. If they're prostitutes, they probably don't have a committed relationship, and so they're just doing their thing. And prostitutes also tend to be disowned by their families, and so they won't have very many connections with them. And so it's very easy to get away with killing one of them. Well, I say very easy. Easier than other groups of people, demographics and whatnot. And so I love what Aristotle has to say about politics, it being like the most noble science, because it's ultimately pursuing, it's like, what is the morality that we can all agree upon, right? And it's trying to nail down, and doing our best to nail down, what should we not do. Whether or not there is an objective morality out there, clearly there are things that a lot of people can agree on, but then clearly there are also things that a lot of people can't agree on, which I think is very interesting, because people can hold contradictory moral standings and points. Like, for example, death sentence versus abortion. There are people who think that it's okay to kill babies who haven't been born yet, and it's not okay to kill criminals. And there are people who think it's okay to kill criminals, but not okay to kill unborn babies.
In fact, usually you find those are the two types. Like, those two beliefs come in packages.
They do, very much so.
But what's fascinating is because those are not necessarily cognitive distance-wise. They're not like two totally separate beliefs. They're informed by the same principle, where people who are anti-abortion believe those are children, whereas people who are anti-abortion are people who don't believe they are children.
You mean people who are pro-abortion?
Yes, people who are
pro-choice,
anti-abortion. People who are pro-choice say pro-choice because to them the element that matters is the choice. They don't view that as a life.
Yeah.
Right? So you're having an argument and two totally different moral, like they're just you cannot, it's a binary. You cannot find a middle ground between those two things. Either it is a life or it is not. And if you believe it is not, then it justifies abortion. And if it is, then it justifies the illegality of abortion. There's no way to reconcile the two things, except for possibly converting people to the other side of belief.
Well, and you can look at this and you can pull out the whole cost-benefit analysis aspect of it, because who keeps I feel like I'm being texted something really important right now because I keep getting messages. Okay, no, I'm not. Anyway, sorry. I didn't realize I was connected to your Wi-Fi. But with abortion, it's like, okay, what is more valuable, the health, safety, well-being of the mother or the health, safety, well-being of a potential child? And it's hard to be like, how valuable is this child going to be for society? Because half the aisle, or people on one side of the aisle, will say, that person could have been a doctor. And the other side might say something like, well, it also could have been another Hitler, right? Or something like that.
Well, I think that what I hear a lot, I don't really hear a lot about what that be. I think that there's definitely an implicit, like, kind of belief, like this economic, like, pragmatism that you need to have more people in society for it to function, like, or else population will age and shit. But I think more so what you see is arguments that, oh, well, so you're pro-life, right? So we should more highly fund adoption and childcare services.
And that I fully agree with.
And,
right?
But interestingly enough, a lot of people's politics who are pro-life, like, their support of the child pretty much ends once it's out of the womb.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, once it's out of the womb,
yeah.
we're not going to support adoption policies, we're not going to support foster care, which in our country, both are fucking awful. Right? Like, terrible. Like, there's plenty of people who want to adopt, but if you get in the foster care system, you're probably going to end up there your entire life, and it's going to fuck up your entire life.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And that's the thing that bothers me, because when people zero in on this issue of abortion, and they do this with other political issues, they miss all the surrounding issues. It's like, I don't think we should be asking, oh, should we allow abortions or not? I think we should be asking is like, do we need to allow abortions or not? And if so, what are things we can do to reduce that? Because I don't know very many people who look at abortion as a good, happy thing.
It isn't,
to do.
Of course,
Exactly.
it's not like, yes, yay.
It's not a lighthearted affair whatsoever. But I fully understand people who are saying, oh yeah, no, it's necessary for this to happen. And they'll give very good reasoning for it. And so it's a cost-benefit analysis of, not necessarily like, oh, is this child going to be worth it? But like, is it worth it to have, another person enter this world without terminating that life for people who agree with that? Or is it more important that this mother is safe and healthy, and is it important that we avoid the risk of the child being born to a family that can't afford to support it, or being sent to a foster family that can't afford to support them properly, and things like that. And so not knowing the future makes it really hard to say, well, which one's better. And same thing with like the death penalty. It's like, well, let's say this person has killed someone. This is a murderer. We know that. We've proven that. Is it better to let them live so that they can possibly contribute to society in a good way? Or should we kill them off now, assuming that will give peace to the people who were affected and affect them positively, and assuming that this person's presence being gone will reduce the risk of them doing something else in the future if they're ever released or whatnot, or if they do something to someone in the jail and whatnot. And so almost all these moral dilemmas that haven't been solved are just ones where people they place different costs and different prices on different things, which I think is very fascinating. It's a weird way of looking at it.
You could really have a conversation with somebody, and even though it's never articulated, you could pretty easily usually find that, like, almost like there's like a numerical value. You can usually, like, people get uncomfortable whenever you bring up numerics in terms of morality, because usually they want to be binary yes or no. But oftentimes it's like, well, is this more important or is that more important?
Yeah,
and then like, very quickly, people who haven't put a lot of thought in these propositions will be uncertain, because why would you put a lot of thought into these things? It's fucking hard.
Yeah, and it becomes like this weird bidding war of like, oh yes, $300 for this thing. Oh well, that thing, $250, $350, and
yes.
It becomes this weird puzzle, and sometimes you can't wrap your head around it, because like if someone came up to me right now and was like, would society be better off if your dad was dead or your mom was dead? I'd be like, what?
Well, it's just like to kind of extrapolate from what you're talking about in context of the abortion and the ethical dilemma. It's like abortion is tied into schooling. It's tied into, like we talked about, adoption, foster care. It's tied into sexual education. It's tied into economics. It's tied in literally everything that has to do with human life, because it's birth.
Yeah.
Right. It is a core fundamental issue that affects everything.
Yeah.
It directly, too.
And then contrastingly, death penalty is death, which also affects everything.
Yes, it is quite like these two really interesting ends of the spectrum. And crime and punishment is, the foundation upon which civilized or complex society rests. So in the context of the death penalty, like, I remember I one time thought to myself, the reason we listen to authority is because fundamentally they have a gun on their hip. I thought to myself one time, it's like, why would you listen to a police officer without a gun on their hip? Right? Because theoretically you wouldn't have to. That's my fun, I think. No, that's yours.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Justin's popular today. Oh no, it's one group chat that has like 24 people in it. That's why.
Yeah, it's going crazy.
Dang, we've already been at for an hour, but continue. And I have one more point, and we should probably wrap it up.
I was just messing my mom back. I think it's really refreshing to have a conversation. It's like, because we do disagree in quite a few things, but it's like we also just acknowledge the tenuous nature upon which the human mind is able to grasp absolute morality, and we choose not to. Like, I want to be a person who stands for my ideals, who articulates them, who tries to take action on them. But I also don't want to be the type of person that refuses to that does like that closes their ears, operates within isolation and their moral doctrine, because that way leads madness.
Yeah,
I think, and sometimes I think that point of view can be interpreted as like ethical cowardice. I think there's definitely like people who are like, you just don't want to take a stance, but it's like because you are afraid to be wrong. It's like, no, I'm not necessarily entirely afraid to be wrong. I'm afraid that somebody else is right, if that makes any sense.
Well, for me, I would be afraid of harming people unknowingly, right? I would be afraid of harming people thinking I'm helping them, right? And so with ethics and with my ethical dogma, it's like you, I want to be able to take stands on things so that we can do things, because inaction is worse than
action.
It
is.
Right. And so, like, as long as I'm working. But part of that action can't just be going out there and advocating for what you currently believe. That action also has to be introspective. And you have to be like, okay, I'm not just working out there in the world, I'm working on myself. I'm working on my own code of ethics. I'm, like an AI training itself, I'm working to make myself better at working. and making the fruits of my efforts
sometimes
better.
you hear somebody talk, and it's just so comforting because you just like you sense this, like they are an AI that has iterated upon themselves thousands of times and is reflected over the very issue you're struggling with.
That's why I think listening to elderly people is so fascinating.
It is. My favorite person of all time is my grandma Lou, but everyone knows that. Well, I mean, tied first place.
Oh, with Randy, I said?
Yeah.
Yeah, I figured. Oh, one thing I wanted to touch on is I think it's interesting how you mentioned, like being against like LGBT, because it very much so it turns into this whole thing of a power struggle, and that's one thing that makes me so mad. It boils my blood when you have these religious groups, and obviously especially Christian ones, who just denounce a people as opposed to denouncing a process, or denounce people for denounce a person who holds an idea or holds value as opposed to denouncing that value. It's because it's when we confuse those that things get really bad. It's the ad hominem fallacy.
I definitely see where you're going. At the same time, it's like if I were to say, I think that people who live the Christian lifestyle, I don't disagree with Christians themselves. I disagree with people who live the Christian lifestyle. How would you interpret that?
Well, I would interpret that as you don't see me as a bad person for being a Christian, much like I don't see people as bad people for being LGBT. I just think that what they are doing, for your stance, you saying that to me would be interpreted as somehow following my Christian ideals is harming me or harming society at large. And while you're not going to call me a bad person because there are good grounds to believe that it's okay to be a Christian, much like there are good grounds to believe that it's okay to be LGBT, hence why there are ethical, differences in these things. But from your perspective, if you were to say that, you are not saying that I'm wrong as a person for being Christian. I'm not a lesser person for being Christian, because there is no hierarchical structure based on me being Christian. It's more about I'm mistaken, right? And so I would not be surprised if you took it upon yourself to try and guide me into not being Christian, because you think that that's somehow harming me. But,
It's like, I guess I have a foundational belief that I guess in certain doctrines. Now, I definitely believe in this. Denounce any type of action, or denounce any type of actions that affect others. For example, if there's an unjust law, or a law you disagree with, or an action of a organization that you disagree with. I think disagreeing with actions, specifically actions that affect others on a grand scale, is where I would be willing to hear you to hear the line being drawn. But whenever you criticize, like, a group of people, you're not criticizing. Whenever you identify a group of people and say, I disagree with that, it does, I think, imply a inferiority, because if you disagree, that means they had the opportunity to disagree as well.
But that's where
right?
That's where Christianity comes in, and it's like, we're all sinners, right? That's the basis. That's a great equalizer. It's like, we are all below God. If we're going to have any kind of hierarchy, it is God, us, right? And that's what we should focus on, as opposed to trying to place ourselves in any kind of order or hierarchy. But that's where a lot of Christians go wrong, because they're like, oh, well, I don't do this specific sin, or what I believe is a sin, so that means I'm better, right? And then the Bible repeatedly tells you, no, you're not better. You still suck, right? But it's through God's grace and forgiveness that you are redeemed.
I guess it's an interesting point of view to take, to say, okay, so it's like, listen, all humans are doing bad. They're all bad. But sometimes it definitely, and I know this is not necessarily what you think, but definitely it sounds sometimes it's from Christians, because I think most faith, and Christianity in particular, tries to operate by its doctrine out of a position of humility. Prostrate yourself before this higher power, acknowledge that you cannot control these things. But the way it often comes across is, we know the way, and you guys are just fucking it up. You're just fucking it up,
yeah.
man. We're telling you what to do.
Yeah.
You're fucking, it sounds so condescending.
It very much does.
And even though sometimes, I don't think you ever mean that. I think that it can sound that way, not necessarily because of what you say, but because of the existence of Christians who say those types of things.
Well,
right? Because you have to purposely disentangle yourself.
I very much do. And so I try to do it lightly. Like, I don't constantly go to my friends and remind them, hey, I'm Christian and I believe that your lifestyle is invalid, right?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I wouldn't even say invalid, right? Because Elijah's brother and I have talked about this a lot. David and I have talked about this a lot. And like when it comes to like LGBT stuff, like you said, it's not harming others. Generally, it's usually like, what are you doing with your own life, and should you have the right to do that? And even though I think it's a lifestyle choice that, I do tend to believe that God does not intend that for people. But I also believe that people should not, it should not enter like any kind of legal space. No one should be barred from choosing that lifestyle.
Yeah,
doing that.
That's separation of church and state and all
exactly, that. Right? Because I know that I don't have it all together, and that there are plenty of things that I do that I think I believe that there are plenty of things that I do or am doing that I think are right, that God's going to make fun of me for it when I go to heaven. He's going to be like, Justin, why did you doing this?
Dude, you programmed those collisions so weird. You should have done this. And you'd be like, motherfucker.
He's just going over all my...
No, it's MIT blocks.
Scratch. It's freaking Scratch. We are all the Scratch cat at the most fundamental level. But like you said, it is really easy to, like, with people who practice things that I don't agree with. It's very easy for me to, when I'm being honest and transparent about my beliefs, it's very easy for me, or anyone for that matter, to come off as, oh, you're doing it wrong, your way is wrong, my way is right, I'm better, because I'm more on the money than you are. And I think overwhelmingly with Christianity, it's like, look, we believe in this God stuff, and we believe that this is what he wants for our lives, and so that's what we're going to follow, and we want other people to follow that. But we're not going to go up to people. At least we shouldn't go up to people and be like, well, you're below me because I have a better idea of what I'm doing than you do, because I just don't believe that's true. I do believe that, it's better to, focus on God and do things that God approves of, and to not do things God doesn't approve of. I believe that is good, but I don't believe that makes you a better person, right? I don't believe that I have any place above anyone else in God's eyes, and that's what the Bible says. God's like, in my eyes, you're all equal, not because no one can harm more people than another, because obviously that's true. Like, you can go out there and start killing people, and you're doing something and affecting more people than someone who's just doing their own thing, obviously. But in God's eyes, that's not what matters, because in God's eyes, it's your closeness to him that matters. And so Christians are all about trying to figure out how to get as close to him as possible. But that proximity to him is never like a relative affair. It's all about your individual connection with him.
It's interesting because I think that from what I've been able to parse out, I won't say not all Christian society, but being where we are, right? There's a decent chunk of Christian society that definitely, maybe they don't realize it, but they do act that way. It's like, yeah, I do all these Christian things. I'm speaking in tongues right now.
Yeah.
Right?
Pentecostal. I mean, I'm Pentecostal, so yeah.
Well, it's just like, when I say that, and it's because the human existence is so subjective. And it's like I watched a really interesting video that was talking about the logical arguments for the existence of God. And it was going through, and it's like, here's a counter argument for that, a counter argument for that. And it's not like saying, I think he was definitely saying, this is definitely why. Like, this is why it's wrong. But he got to the end, it's like, then the final one is personal experience, arguing for the existence of God from personal experience, like seeing something or hearing a voice or something like that. And what's really interesting is, as soon as you get to that premise,
you can't really argue.
You really can't argue it, because the argument, you definitely, like, theoretically, the argument would go, one person goes, I had this experience. The person would go, no, you didn't. And the other person would be, for that person to win the argument, this person would go, okay, yeah, you're right. I didn't have that.
And that's probably never going to happen.
That's probably never going to happen. It's just interesting how it boils down. I think we've had this conversation before about we were debating the existence of God and, like, logically proving it through the Thomas Aquinas argument, like the chain of events going backwards.
Oh, the cosmological argument.
And I genuinely think that, and it's not necessarily inherently wrong, because it is a part of the limitations of the human experience. But I genuinely believe at a certain point, faith is the only connection between God and logic, because he exists outside of, obviously, he's God.
Well, and I agree. Like, right? Take the teleological argument, for example, which is my personal favorite, and it's saying that everything in the universe is so fine-tuned, from like the physical constants and the relationships between temperature, pressure, volume, speed of light, stuff like that. They're all so perfectly balanced that the odds of the universe existing without them just earth-shatteringly low. So it makes more sense to believe in a God who did all that, then it makes more sense to believe that than to believe, oh, it just randomly happened that way. But there's also the possibility that, like, universes are created and destroyed or whatever, countless times every second, or that the universe like resets every now and then with a certain set of properties, or that anytime a universe is created, it has to have these properties for some unknown reason, right? And so you could go like a more scientific route without, or not scientific, an atheistic route of saying the universe just operates this way. We might not be able to explain why from within that universe, but it just does, and there's no necessary.
But what if? I don't know anything. This is not like based in academics or anything. This is just like a random thought. But like, what if our universe exists in the play? We're like a universe, and then there's like a universe. It's filled with universes. And then there's a universe.
Well, that's kind of what
that's kind of the
saying,
argument. Yeah, it's like there is a system, we can't see it
because the system might just be all possible universes exist, and obviously we just happen to be in one that allowed for beings to exist that are able to question the nature of their existence, right? You could always go that way, but either way is a leap of faith, and
very much so. It's like at some point you just have to be like, okay, I don't know. And anyone who pretends that they do know is wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at the very least, not right.
Yeah, and with people, for example, who say in personal experience, they're like, oh, I encountered God and I know it was God, and blah 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 blah. The nature of knowledge and belief is unfortunately too frail.
Yeah.
To say that with 100% certainty, much like unfortunately, I cannot say with 100% certainty that we are recording an episode of The Loudest Crow right now. Like, it sure does seem like it.
You're right. You could go moments right? It could be like, okay, corrupted. Your hard drive's corrupted.
Yeah, that. Or I could wake up in like 3 seconds and I'll be like, what? Or I'll blink and you'll just be gone, and this house will be like deteriorated.
Yeah, there's definitely like, there's. Whenever you get educated, the number one thing you learn in every single field, period, is that okay, so. Here's how we best can explain things, understand things, but also, like, we don't know.
We don't know, yeah.
It's like, fundamentally, there is an end to knowledge that exists that is constantly being pushed, but it's always going to be there. Because it's just like the universe is always expanding, right? It's like the simple law of the universe. It's like we can never know with certainty, but that doesn't, like to summarize the entire conversation of this episode, I think, just because you can never know with certainty does not belie that something is wrong.
Exactly.
It does not. That does not demand inaction.
Well, and it goes into some logical fallacies that my ethics book talks about, which are like I forgot what they're called, but appeal to ignorance. Okay, you can't say something that is not proven to be true is false, and you can't say something that is not proven to be false is true. And when it comes to unprovable things, you can't go either way. So it's like, it's unprovable if God exists. Well, then that means that you can't say it's true or false with 100% certainty.
Yeah, you can't. And there may never be a way to prove with 100% certainty, and that's okay.
Now I'm imagining, say I get to heaven, I'm up there with God, and I'm like, sweet. But what if this is all a simulation?
But something that's a funny belief, but something I think that might be true too, and something to reflect on maybe. Perhaps knowing there is a God with 100% certainty would put you further away from him.
In a way, yeah,
you know
because
what I mean?
There's no point in being faithful to him, and because you have to ask, is it more valuable to live a godly life based on faith, or based on knowing that's what you're supposed to do? Kind of like with a child, like, is it better for them to behave?
Because they fear the rod, or is it better for them to behave because they learned how to behave properly just because they did?
Yeah, because then you're asking about, was it like integrity? You're asking about integrity, and it's like, are you doing it because you know it's right, or are you doing it because
you fear the gun on the police officer's head?
You fear the gun on the police officer's head. All ties.
I think that's a good way to end it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting conversation. It's yeah.
Honestly, though, I am really good. I am really glad that school's back in session, because I think
me too. I feel like it enriches my brain, even if I disagree with the originalist perspective my constitutional law teacher takes on the U.S. Constitution. But I'll save that for next time.
Just remember, Susie wanted knowledge, so she went to college, just to find out that nothing is true.
Okay, here's your college diploma, and the rest of your life you're going to live in existential dread. Congratulations. Oh, so what'd you learn in political science? We're all wrong.
We're all wrong all the time, and we don't even know if time is a thing or if wrong is a thing. So
yeah, cool. We have Coke Zero though. Please sponsor us.
Coke Zero, existential dread, not today.
Not today, man. It's tasty.